We've been discussing Extinction Rebellion and whether what we saw from them over the weekend is doing a little bit more harm to the cause of climate change than good. Is it actually making you less likely to want to do something about climate change? Is it making you less sympathetic to the cause? I have to say that I'm slightly confused by the tactics of Extinction Rebellion and the fact that, as I mentioned before, we've seen them blocking roads, protesting emissions caused by congestion. So they created congestion in order to protest congestion. We saw them gluing themselves to public transport in order to remind us to use more public transport, something a bit difficult if you're glued to said train. And now they're telling us that we need to know more about climate change from newspapers, whilst simultaneously blocking a national newspaper which carried an opinion piece by one of the most respected broadcasters on the subject of climate change. So for me, some of this seems to be about defeating the object, and I'm sorry to say, these are about political goals as well. Well, joining me to discuss this is an Extinction Rebellion representative, Donnachadh McCarthy, who joins us live via video link. Good evening to you, Donnachadh. Are you there?
Good evening, Cristo. Thank you for having me on again.
Thanks for taking the time to talk to us here again on talkRADIO. Why would Extinction Rebellion think that it's a good idea to stop the printing presses or stop newspapers being able to get onto the shelves? What have they got against free speech?
Sure. We've nothing against free speech. What our position is that the vast majority of the UK press, especially the billionaire press, is very much at the moment promoting high carbon lifestyles, consumption, and actually has been opposing many things that actually require to be done to take urgent action on climate change. And so we have done peaceful protests, we've done letters, we've done meetings, and yet all through the last 3 or 4 months, the media has been about promoting and restoring the carbon economy after the CV-19 crisis. Hundreds of billions of pounds are going back into restoring aviation, cars, etc., consumption. And we're in a crisis. If the government's own climate change advisor said, we have to prepare for 4 degrees centigrade rise.
We have to prepare for it, but that doesn't guarantee that that's what's coming.
Crisis.
We have to prepare for it. That doesn't guarantee that's what's coming. It's just that something that we were told we had to prepare for. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a fact that 4 degrees is coming.
Absolutely. And that's why we want the action taken, so it doesn't become a reality, because the committee said it's so mind-blowingly dangerous for British society and for the future of our kids, endangering our food supply, endangering our oceans, etc., that we have to do everything possible to make sure 4 degrees doesn't happen. It's unconscionable we could let it happen.
How can people believe you, Donnachadh, when firstly what you're discussing and what Extinction Rebellion have been known for previously, and I respect that perhaps they've altered their views now, but even listening to you now discussing how we're trying to rebuild our economy, how can you convince us that this is not just an organisation which is about being anti-capitalist rather than climate change? They had it listed on their own website before it was deleted when they first started the year before last, that they were anti-capitalist. Extinction Rebellion, if you like, I can read you the tweet that they deleted from their own account, which was saying that they were anti-capitalism. Now, I realise that obviously, I'll read it to you actually. Extinction Rebellion, this movement is the best chance we have of bringing down capitalism. Get on board. Induction through the day at Parliament Square. You are welcome, you are needed. That was sent on the 18th of the 4th, 2019, and then deleted some months later. So how can you convince us that you're a climate change organisation and not a political organisation that has political socialist goals?
No, fair question. The tweet got deleted because it actually wasn't the representative of what the organisation is about. We've got 3 simple demands. We want Parliament and the media to tell the truth on the depth of the urgency. We want a zero carbon economy within 5 years. And we want a Citizens' Assembly to decide to recommendations for the government on the fairest way of doing that. To do that, we need a wide coalition of people from all backgrounds, whether it's left, right or centre. My own background is Liberal Democrat. I used to be a Liberal Democrat councillor. I was deputy chair of the party. I know Tories who support us. I know socialists who support us. There are communists, there are anarchists, there are Labour Party members, there are Green Party members, and that's what we need. We're saying to society, this is so urgent, it needs to be beyond party politics.
You don't feel like you're losing public support?
That's why we're not an anti-capitalist movement, we're not a pro-capitalist
Well, then why would they tweet that? Why would they tweet that? Why would it have been listed on their website months ago, now deleted as one of the goals?
Because the person who was in charge of the Twitter account at that stage was
and the person in charge of the website ages ago as well.
Yes, it was wrong, and we got it deleted. There are people who are left-wingers in the movement. We admit that, but there are also Tories, and there are Liberal Democrats like me and Green Party members.
Well, yeah, but the mistaken tweet sent out wasn't...
We're about actually ensuring we saved Britain, not destroyed it.
Yeah, but the mistaken tweet sent out wasn't sent out by a free marketeer who wants to see capitalism and creativity and motivation through perhaps incentivising people to come up with ways in which we can get out of this climate crisis. Coincidentally, it was just the anti-capitalism tweet that ended up being sent out.
Well, I think...
Can you understand our cynicism, Donnachadh?
That's fine. I mean, I accept that when you see a tweet like that, you will say the whole movement is like that. But it's 250,000 people. You can imagine how organising a new movement. But I'd like to give you another quote. You've given me that quote. Yeah. Let me give you a quote back. One of the reasons why we actually staged the protest outside Broxbourne and Liverpool was that we believe that we don't actually have a free press in this country. When you have around 3 families based in tax havens who are billions who have bought large chunks of our media, and it has huge consequences for the actions of climate in this country. And the quote I want to give you is, when it was a quote from the Evening Standard, Anthony Hilton. He asked Rupert Murdoch, why do you hate the European Union? And he said, I quote, "When I go into Downing Street, they do as I say. When I go to Brussels, they take no notice." Now, Rupert Murdoch is renowned globally as one of the world's most active opponents of climate action, whether it's in America supporting the Trump agenda, whether in Australia toppling 3 prime ministers who were taking action on climate change, or in the United Kingdom with the Sun paper, which has been massively supporting cuts to fossil fuel duties and expansion of our hydrocarbon.
Why would they have carried an opinion piece by David Attenborough then if they were so against climate activism, where David Attenborough himself actually in that piece claims that you need to be able, if I'm paraphrasing a little, but following laws, you can't really ask for new laws regarding in the environment and climate if you're not going to follow laws yourself. Why would a newspaper carry that kind of opinion piece? Why would a newspaper carry an opinion piece from David Attenborough outlining the personal things that you and I can do on a daily basis to be more environmentally friendly? Why would a newspaper against climate activism publish an article like that?
Well, the point is, it's a fair question. I would argue that if you look at all the papers, whether it's the Guardian, the Independent, the Times, the Sun, they all carry occasional opinion op-eds from prominent environmentalists or editorials.
The most prominent environmentalist and probably the most well-respected, with one of the biggest audiences whose programmes get millions of views. Well, that's a very different narrative to what you just gave a moment ago about Rupert Murdoch apparently being so against any kind of climate activism. Now he's putting the most famous climate activist front and centre in his newspaper, and your actions stopped people reading it.
Well, no, they didn't actually, because actually it was in the Sun on Sunday, so everybody more.
Well, yes, because it was a decision was taken by the Sun to republish it. That wasn't down to you guys. That was down to the editorial team of the Sun wanting people to read important activism about climate. Do go on explaining why the Sun doesn't like climate activism.
The point is that nearly all the press include the occasional article by an environmentalist, but then if you look at the rest of the Sun. Its campaign to cut fuel duty has cut £110 billion and given that to the fossil fuel lobby, £110 billion over the last 10 years. And it's campaigning to expand coal, oil and gas fields in the United Kingdom. Now, those two things, beside one article by David Attenborough, completely
how are they campaigning to increase the use of forest?
I'd really like to make about Rupert Murdoch is it's not me. It's actually James Murdoch himself resigned from News Corp because of his objections to the impact that Rupert Murdoch has had in the News Corp, whether it's in America, UK or Australia. And he understands that the disaster that has caused in Australia.
Well, I don't think that you can claim to know every single reason as to why James Murdoch might have left the Murdoch family empire. I think that's a fair comment to make within that context. And also, surely if the Sun are fighting to get rid of fuel duty, that is about trying to save money for motorists who are up against it, who have been hammered when it comes to fuel duty, hammered when it comes to taxes, hammered when it comes to vehicles emissions duty. And so, frankly, thank goodness that there is a newspaper that is standing up for motorists.
Well, you can't have it both ways, Cristo. You can't have it saying the Sun is taking action on climate by having one article by David Attenborough.
Well, no, numerous articles it's had.
To give £110 billion to the oil industry.
Well, why can't it campaign on both? Why can't it have a range of views? That is what free speech is, Donnachadh. It's a range of views. A newspaper can have some people believing that fuel duty should be lowered, and it can have opinion pieces from some people, like David Attenborough, who might have a completely opposing view. That is the essence of a free press. Why would you want to stop that?
But what you have to look at is the actual the wide editorial content of a newspaper. And we're actually saying, it's not just the billionaire press who have captured a huge chunk of our media, and we think that's very disastrous for our democracy and for free speech. And actually, on the issue of free speech, the day Priti Patel and Boris Johnson attacked us for we just paused the newspapers for 12 hours. But he contacted us an attack on free speech. It wasn't an attack on free speech. What was an attack on free speech is what the Council of Europe that day said the UK government was actually blacklisting investigative journalists and banning certain programs from having government ministers on it. And they said that Britain is now on the blacklist for free speech in Europe. It's now, according to them, the Council of Europe, they've associated Britain with Turkey and with Russia. Now that's a real attack.
And I would agree completely. I would agree completely. What a shame Extinction Rebellion now don't have the credibility and now come across as hypocrites when they criticise that. What a shame. Because actually, had they not stood in front and tried to stop the press getting onto newsstands, I think you'd have an absolutely perfectly valid point on free speech. Now, I'm afraid it sounds really hypocritical, especially on the subject of hypocrisy. Let's talk about the film Climate Crisis and why we should panic. Didn't Extinction Rebellion need to drop the claim that climate breakdown is killing 400,000 people every year, which science couldn't back, and also that it was there was another claim in there as well, that statements that could not be backed up by science and had to be removed from the film after it had been released. Now, again, how can you possibly complain about the editorial output of newspapers and the fact that they're on the wrong side of history, not really being as factual on this crisis as they should be, when Extinction Rebellion's own videos need re-editing because they're not factually accurate?
Well, I would argue that my understanding is that the edit was done before it was released. And actually, I would argue that any organization that actually edits to make sure any facts are in it are watertight is actually a positive thing for us. Any newspaper, whether you're a Sun editor or a Guardian editor, you go through an article that's submitted and you check the facts.
No, the original version, by the way,
Donnachadh, within it, and you actually make sure that they are. And what is wrong with editing the film?
Because the original film was viewed by 54,000 people before it was then re-edited. So 54,000 people got the 400,000 people are dying from climate change version already, and then it was re-edited.
Well, actually, whether we're going to argue about whether it's 300,000 or 400,000 is kind of weird.
No, what we're arguing about is the fact that Extinction Rebellion are complaining about inaccuracies and problems with our press when you can't even get your own house in order to make sure that your own content doesn't have inaccuracies. Don't you think that's a little bit hypocritical? Don't you think it's a little hypocritical to criticise the government?
It's actually an argument about how many saints are on a tin. There is a report by the UN Kofi Annan, the former UN General Secretary. I can't remember the organization. Their research said over 300,000 people a year are dying from the consequences of climate change already. But actually, on the more important issue, whether it's 300,000 or 400,000, the Potsdam Institute and the Tyndall Center, global centers of expertise on climate, have said that if we head, as the CCC says, we are possibly heading towards 4 degrees centigrade, it is incompatible with civilization as we know it. And so
well, then why didn't they keep it in? Then why did Extinction Rebellion then hold their hands up and say, well, actually, you're right, science couldn't back that 400,000 people a year claim, so we'll take it out. Now you're saying they should have left it in then.
No, I'm saying that I am aware of scientific reports by the UN that says over 300,000. Now, maybe that was the fact that just 400,000 wasn't actually watertight, and they didn't have there wasn't agreement on the peer review for that particular number. But it's definitely by the UN, it's over 300,000. So I think we're arguing about angels on a pin.
No, what we're arguing about,
if we don't take action, number of people, the threat is terrifying.
No, Donnachadh, what we're arguing about is credibility, and what we're arguing about is Extinction Rebellion's position that newspapers are not being truthful and are giving inaccurate information. And what we're arguing about is the fact that, as I said, one of your own videos was pulled up for the precise same thing, and it just is all about the credibility, really, if you're going to have a go at the government about freedom of speech.
This is a classic silly story by the right-wing media that was started by the Times to undermine us and discredit.
Well, then why did it work?
Arguing about whether 300,000 or 400,000 people are going to die, are dying already every year, is a bit silly when we're actually talking about the fate of billions of people.
So you're against Extinction Rebellion, who decided then to re-edit the video then? I mean, if it was a silly right-wing conspiracy, they really surely shouldn't have responded to it, should they?
Cristo, I think this conversation it doesn't do you justice. It's a tiny detail.
No,
but actually, the
you
real
are
issue
claiming
is
that newspapers
the
are not
Potsdam
being
Institute
accurate.
And the Tyndall Institute, global institutes, are saying we're in a dangerous situation unless we take radical action.
But you cannot take a position,
Donnachadh,
you cannot take a position that the threat is being underplayed by others, by the government and by newspapers, when your own organisation overplayed the threat. Don't you see why that takes away the credibility of Extinction Rebellion?
I think this is sad that this is what you're talking about.
I couldn't agree more.
There was two different scientific reports, one with 400,000, one with 300,000. People thought we better go with the 300,000 one. So can we please talk about the situation that 70% that we have lost 60% of nature in the last 50 years, and we're losing at a 1% per year. Can we not talk about what actions we need to be taken? And the fact that our own government has been found by the Climate Change Committee to be failing on 17 sectors out of 21 on taking the actions that we need to be getting to zero carbon. Isn't that what we should be talking about, rather than the detail of whether it's 300?
I couldn't agree more, but again, you have to think, Donnachadh, of the credibility of the words coming from Extinction Rebellion when they have been proven wrong on something that they've said already. And again,
I think let's move on.
All right. Well, listen. If it's all right, do you want to? We've had a call for you from a gentleman called David who's hanging on, but we didn't ask you whether you were prepared to take a call. So I'm more than happy, Donnachadh, if you'd rather not. But someone wants to put a question to you.
No, I think I'm open to being accountable. That's
okay.
fair.
Hold on one second, then. David, are you there?
Hello there, yes.
Hey, David. Well, Donnachadh is here. You rang to put a question to him. I don't know what that question is, but what would you like to ask him?
Hello, Donnachadh. Donnachadh, I've heard you say that it's only acceptable for people to go abroad if they're going to a funeral. But my question is, how can an airline sustain itself on just that market?
All right, Donnachadh, what would you say about that?
Sorry, I think what I said was actually I understand we should be reducing aviation to essential journeys, whether for family reasons or for urgent business reasons. The reason why that is that taking a flight can be an extraordinary amount of carbon. So, for example, a family of 4 were flying to New Zealand. That would take around almost 30 years of carbon emissions from their household electricity. It's that enormous. So in terms of carbon footprint, we need to be getting down to 1 ton per person. So that would blow almost 40 years of your carbon budget by going on a family flight to New Zealand. So I'm afraid that's why at the moment with CV19, we've had a huge collapse in the aviation industry. And what the government should be doing is training those staff for the new green economy, for the jobs that are sustainable.
But do you understand, Donnachadh, then?
Find a sustainable way of flying.
But Donnachadh, that means essentially, and forgive me if I'm misrepresenting you, but aren't you essentially saying, well, we've got an economy, an airline industry that's on its backside now as a result of COVID-19, and actually we should probably just let it fail and think about other ways in which we can travel? I mean, is that essentially what you're calling for, because I can't see any other way in which we can get the airline industry back up and running unless we all travel, and that's not something you want us to do. So are you essentially saying we'll let the airlines fail?
Well, what we're saying is that, this Extinction Rebellion doesn't have official policy on every single thing, but on a personal basis, I'm not speaking on that particular issue, if that's okay.
Yeah, fine.
We can't afford to, at the level of flights that we are currently taking, and tackle climate change in time. So that obviously means that we have to have a radical reduction in the size of the aviation industry on such time it can be done sustainably. And that means jobs have to change, and the government needs to, rather than squandering money, maintaining an industry that is currently bankrupt and wasting that money of borrowing from future generations to bail out a dirty industry, we should be investing in clean jobs so that the future of our kids is protected.
Can I ask you something, Donnachadh? And it's just, again, this isn't Extinction Rebellion. It's almost, I think it gets to the crux of where we disagree. For me, the issue with climate change activism is that every single bit of it focuses on individuals being penalised for their lives and having their lives restricted as a result of the climate change action that people like you and Extinction Rebellion called for. And I think what frustrates people is that if you were calling on car companies or airline companies or jet fuel companies or Total or any of the 5 big industries that were released in the report today, saying that they contribute to a fifth of carbon emissions. If you were telling us that you were campaigning for ways in which myself and David can still fly going forward, or that you were campaigning for a way in which myself and my listeners could still drive going forward, I would be on board with you. I would be saying, this man, he is campaigning not for my freedoms to be taken away from me, but for a way in which we can still live our lives going forward, but in a way in which our freedoms aren't taken and we're still environmentally friendly. Do you feel that sometimes the climate change cause, they should be actually focusing on the means of production? Like I said, the airline manufacturers, the fuel suppliers, the car makers, rather than individuals like me and my listeners who pay their taxes, who try and go about their lives day to day and are continually told that their freedoms need to be restricted?
Well, I think Extinction Rebellion doesn't have policies on how to restrict people's freedoms. That's not what Extinction Rebellion campaigns for.
No, but that's usually a byproduct.
The wider environmental movement, I would say it's actually both. In terms of, so for example, electricity, we have campaigned for the grid to be greened, so that the big energy companies can switch our energy from coal to solar and wind, and that's actually happening quite well. The government, I hope you appreciate. I will give the government kudos when it does something good.
I'm no advocate for this government, Donnachadh. You don't have to. I'm no advocate for this particular government, Donnachadh. So you don't have to say that it's brilliant that you're giving the government credit to me. Go on, though.
Well, anyway, on that particular sector, that is actually happening. So the government has actually helped the electricity sector move from coal to main truth. So we're around over 2/3 of the way there. So that's actually excellent work.
But why don't they stop doing that, though? Why don't they stop having a go at people like me and my listeners? And why don't they just concentrate on the big industries, like we heard today? Like I said, that so many of them are contributing to climate change. I think they found the five or six big sectors that were a fifth of CO2 emissions coming from, it was in the science and technology of, it was the report today, large multinational companies and their wide-reaching supply chains are to blame for almost 1/5 of the world's carbon dioxide emissions. A study found the true carbon footprint of companies such as Total and BP and Coca-Cola and a few others as well that are all causing these terrible Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, Total, BP, the Dow, Samsung, Apple, Volkswagen, Toyota, and Costco. Now, again, why aren't you focusing on those producers of such things rather than people like me, the hard-working consumer who's sick of being told that they're not doing enough?
Well, if you followed my writing, I write a column for The Independent, and most of my writing in my climate column is actually on those strategic issues, such as BP and Shell.
But why aren't Extinction Rebellion focusing on them then?
So can I talk about? You were talking about you said the wider environmental movement. So let me answer the question you asked me. So I write quite extensively about Shell and BP because actually there's a Danish oil and gas company that is now a renewable energy company. And we would love if Shell and BP went down that route. And what Shell and BP doing, which is quite shocking, is they are planning to spend something like 75 to 100 billion pounds on expanding fossil fuels over the next 10 years. Now, we would say if they invested that money, like the Danish corporation did, in renewable energy and renewable systems and to power our economy by renewable energy, that would be fantastic and it would make profit. The Danish company, it's actually used to be called Danish Oil and Natural Gas. It had to change its name to Ørsted because it doesn't do any oil and gas anymore. And they make £4 billion profit a year. And we are calling on the government and on the Bank of England to stop lending money to Shell and BP for oil and gas and to lend it to them if they want it for renewables. So yes, I'm with you on that.
Well, no, I think that's brilliant. And I think if Extinction Rebellion weren't sort of fanning around closing roads, and if Extinction Rebellion weren't fanning around with newspaper boycotts and demonstrations, and we were actually focusing on this stuff, I think a lot more people would be on board with them. And one final point to make, Donnachadh, you know where I read that report today about a fifth of all global CO2 emissions coming from the supply chain of large multinational companies? In the Daily Mail, one of the newspapers that you claim isn't talking enough about climate change. So I don't know whether you can see the irony in that, but I can.
And I'll actually explain that, because actually I bet you one of those large corporations that we're talking about is the aviation industry. And the Daily Mail will probably have 20 or 30 pages of long-haul flights, cruise ships, etc., trying to encourage us to go on flights abroad. And that's what they make the profit on. And I recognise the problem for the paper industry, whether it's right, left, or centre.
By the way, the airline industry isn't one of those.
Their business model is dependent on fossil fuel advertising. So we have a systemic problem here.
By the way, the airline industry isn't one of those. There are two fuel companies on there, which is Total and BP.
But they supplied the fuel to the aviation industry.
Yeah, totally. That's why I'm including that. But no, the actual airlines themselves are not included. Donnachadh, thank you very much indeed. Good to catch up with you as always. That's Donnachadh McCarthy from Extinction Rebellion.